Okay, class, let's start. Okay, so I have an announcement first of all. So next week, we're going to change venue. So we're not going to meet here. We're going to meet in G10 Biotech. Okay, and the reason for that is this climate seminar will join the Cornell Project 2030. And Cornell Project 2030 is a project launched by Cornell to advance climate change solutions in this decade. So it's a big, wide project throughout Cornell, and the inaugural speaker for Project 2030 will meet in Biotech G10 along with this class and also members of the Cornell community at large. So an announcement on Canvas, so but just to give you warning in advance. Okay, so as usual, I'd like to thank the Cornell Atkinson Center and the Biological Environmental Engineering Department for their sponsorship of this seminar. So today is my really great pleasure to welcome Gretchen Goldman. And Dr. Goldman is from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she serves as the Assistant Director for Environmental Science, Engineering, Policy, and Justice. I'm particularly happy to welcome Dr. Goldman because she is a Cornell alumni, graduated in atmospheric science. And then she went on to get a master's and a PhD in environmental engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Okay, following that, she became an assistant director for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And where she leads research and advocacy efforts at the nexus of science and policy. And these efforts include such things as fossil fuel production, climate change, environmental justice. And as such, she contributes in significant ways to various groups, 500 Women Scientists, California Geologic Energy Division, and the Air and Climate Policy Advisory Committee for Metropolitan Washington. And also for the UNESCO AAAS Consultation Group on US Science Ecosystem. So let's give, even though Gretchen is remote, let's give her a warm welcome.
Great, well, thank you so much. It's so good to be here. I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person, but I'm really happy to talk with you today. And especially, of course, Cornell has a very important place in my heart as an alum, and I'm excited to talk with you today. So as was said, I work in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And so today I'm going to give you a little bit more about the work that I do there. And I hope that you'll take away some of the substance of the kinds of work that we're doing here. But I also want to integrate into this talk a lot of thoughts about the process and where we sit in the structure of decision-making at the federal level, because I think one important element that you all can take away from this and all the seminars in this series and other courses you're taking is sort of all the different places where you can be working on climate change from different angles. And there's really a need for all kinds of people to be working in this space from all different places. And so I'm hopeful to give you a little bit about one place you can sit and think about these issues more broadly. And so in that vein, I wanted to start with thinking about where I sit. So this is physically where I sit. This is the Eisenhower Executive Office building. It is a building next to the White House in Washington, D.C. And it's where a lot of the offices of the president are. So there's the Executive Office of the President includes a lot of different components, some of which you've heard of, many of which you probably have not. But there's a whole bunch of different parts of the White House that work on different elements of the administration and their agenda. agenda. And one of those places is focused on science and technology. And so what that means is that we're in this unique place of being thinking about science and technology and having sort of a foot in the door of the scientific community and thinking about where science and technology is going, but also being in a very policy-oriented environment and thinking about, how do we advance the president's agenda with respect to science and technology policy. And so that gives us this really unique place of being able to both engage with all of the federal agencies, so every part of the federal government that works on different kinds of issues of science and technology and health and protecting the public, and also thinking about a lot of the moving pieces of a policy environment where it's very fast-paced and a lot of what you're doing is responsive to what's happening in the policy world. And so I wanted to give you that context so you can see where I'm coming from on this. And so in thinking about where do these priorities come from in the administration, we look at what direction we get from higher up, so from the White House, and what are their priorities are for the administration. And so for the Biden-Harris administration, they have made both climate and equity huge central points of the president's agenda. And so right from day one, the president has been committed to tackling the climate crisis. This was one of the top priorities of the administration. And early on in the administration, there was executive actions that made this clear, that the United States and the world face a profound climate crisis, and together we must listen to the science and meet the moment. And then at the same time, there's a huge focus in the administration on racial equity. This was also really early on in the administration. The president made clear that this was a huge priority to address a lot of the systemic racism and other elements that have held back many of us from perpetuating, from having the same access to resources and prosperity as the rest of the nation. And so early on, the president directed the federal government to assess whether agency programs and policies perpetuate systemic barriers to opportunities and benefits for people of color and other underserved groups. So not just looking ahead and what we can do now, but also really doing that assessment of what has happened. What are we doing now that might not have equal impacts on people, and how can we address those? And so they really wanted that to be a holistic, all of government approach where we look at where we've been, what kinds of inequities are there in the system, and how do we address it. And we've also taken a similar approach on gender equity. And so the president early on directed his administration and the government to advance gender equity and equality with sensitivity to the experience of those who suffer discrimination based on multiple factors, including membership in an underserved community. And so really thinking about taking that intersectional approach and looking at these different dimensions of gender and race and other memberships and other groups that might suffer discrimination. And so this is a really big deal for the federal government and the White House to prioritize all of these issues and to prioritize them all together. And so I wanted to focus on these priorities and what that looks like when we think about the climate crisis and focusing on racial and gender equity, and what can we do with that sort of lens and that sort of drive from the position of the White House. And so first, I would just say, as you likely know, and I'm sure you've heard in the seminar many times, that climate change is not going to affect everyone equally. And in fact, some of those who are going to be hit first and worst by the climate crisis are the same communities that have been burdened for decades with other sorts of environmental threats. And so climate change is really a threat multiplier. We see that it might cause some new risks that are happening now or might happen in the future, but it's also exacerbating a lot of the existing risks and vulnerabilities and challenges that a lot of communities have faced for a long time. And so when we want to tackle the climate crisis, we can't do it without looking at those historic inequities and how that has affected everything we've been able to do, and who's been able to thrive and who hasn't in our society. And so in thinking about how to tackle the climate crisis in different ways, I wanted to focus here on a couple ways that we're thinking about that intersection between climate and equity. And so the first part of my talk is going to focus on a few little pieces just to give you sort of sample of some of the kinds of things that we're thinking about and doing around climate and equity together. And then I'm going to go into some of the work that we're doing to advance environmental justice. This has been a key flagship part of the administration as well, to focus on environmental justice specifically. So I want to talk about that. And then I also want to highlight this new innovative work that we're doing to elevate Indigenous knowledge in federal decision making. And this relates to a lot of the climate work and is also much broader than that. And so it represented sort of a unique way that we're thinking about this. And so I wanted to feature that in particular here. So first, in thinking about what does it mean to prioritize both climate and equity, and what does that actually look like in the kind of work that we're doing at the White House? So first, I want to highlight this event that we held recently in thinking about climate delayism. And so if we want to tackle climate change, we need to recognize that the current reality of the challenge that we face as a nation and the world. There has been for decades, and still are, forces arrayed against the cause of climate action. And this has run the gamut from self-interest and short-term thinking to deliberate misinformation campaigns that deceive the public and decision makers. Powerful vested interests have skillfully manipulated the narrative and prevented or stalled climate action. And this, of course, has occurred at the same time that we've had this vast understanding and broad awareness of the physical science aspects of climate change. And yet we see this delay and obstruction as something that has held us back from being able to address the climate crisis. And so we cannot ignore, as a scientific community, we can't ignore these forces that are preventing us from taking action on what we know the science tells us. And the reality is that our world is a coupled social and environmental system. And so we must understand it this way, and we must deal with it as an integrated system. So in addition to the physical sciences that tell us a lot about climate change and climate impacts, we must also focus on the social science. And so we, as the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, hosted this event where the White House brought together climate scientists from both the natural and social sciences and other experts as well, to discuss the scientific understanding of why arguments for delaying action on climate change are so appealing and how they can be countered effectively. So at that link, you can learn more about this event and some of the work that we're doing about thinking about this policy context in which we really want to address climate change in various ways, but we're hit with this challenge of actually getting the action. And so I wanted to share that as well. And another piece that I wanted to share was some work that we're doing around industrial decarbonization. And so this is an example of something we're doing that's a little more on the technical side. And so to back up a little bit about that, at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, one of the things that we really are in a position to do uniquely compared to other parts of the government is to understand where scientific and technical advancements are and where they're going, and how to make sure that the policy keeps up with the science. So this means understanding the policy dimensions of the science and technology issues that we're focused on. So this includes things like what kinds of policies could help spur innovation, or what kind of guardrails should be put in place as we're advancing technology to ensure that no damage is done while we're ramping up new technologies in big ways. And how can science play a pivotal role in improving prosperity for all, for our nation, for the world? And what are the most pressing societal challenges that science and technology can help us answer? And so climate change, of course, is one of these pressing problems that's urgent and that we really need to think about, and includes a lot of technical elements. And one big part of tackling the climate crisis is decarbonizing our economy. And so this decarbonization effort is one of the major technological advances that's going to require science and policy working together. It's a shift with implications for many facets of our society, and government decision makers will have to play a key role in ensuring a successful transition. And so importantly, as government decision makers, we must take deliberate steps to ensure that that transition is equitable, so that when we transition to clean energy, that the outcomes of that transition are equitable. Because when we look historically, we see that science has not always been used as a force for good. And in many cases, science has been complicit in perpetuating inequities, or sometimes even inflicting harm. And especially given that we know that the effects of climate change aren't equally shared, we have to ensure that our transition to clean energy is equitable, that it doesn't leave people behind, and that we aren't burdening the same disadvantaged communities that were already disproportionately bearing the burden of climate change and other environmental threats to also face burdens from the transition. And so any adverse effects of decarbonization must be eliminated, mitigated, minimized, because we know that if equity is not centered in our efforts to accelerate the clean energy economy, that any adverse impacts that do happen will disproportionately fall to some, and the benefits of a clean energy economy may not be enjoyed by all. And this is why much of the Biden-Harris administration's work to tackle climate change focuses on addressing these longstanding inequities. And so along with the new and amplified threats that are posed by the climate crisis, we know that our efforts to tackle it must also be more equitable. And so this is some work that we're doing that I wanted to introduce out to think about industrial decarbonization research. And so we recently launched a new initiative for interdisciplinary industrial decarbonization research. And climate scientists around the world, as you know, have been leaders in communicating the seriousness of the climate crisis and the perils of delaying strong climate action. And engineers and innovators have shown the possibility that we can unlock by transitioning to clean energy and climate-ready systems. And successfully solving the climate crisis requires cooperation between climate science, technology, and social sciences, and learning across the traditional disciplinary boundaries. And so OSDP's initiative for interdisciplinary industrial decarbonization research will enable social, behavioral, economic sciences, as well as interdisciplinary research to develop evidence-based approaches to help build consensus necessary to ensure that a just transition to a clean energy industry with new good paying jobs and for American workers, and health and economic benefits for communities. And so I want to switch gears and talk about another element of what we're thinking about in terms of thinking about climate and equity. And so one big challenge of doing a lot of this work is that it tends to be fairly abstract. It tends to be fairly high level because we're doing policy at a national scale. And so I wanted to share this example because it's one that has had and continues to have real on the ground impacts and benefits for people that are already happening. And so the Biden-Harris administration's been working to facilitate more equitable recovery for survivors of natural and climate-driven disasters. And so across the federal government, agencies are assessing and implementing ways to better reach communities that are typically underserved by federal disaster recovery efforts. And as part of this initiative, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, recently underwent a 30-day equity sprint, and that included an assessment of places where the agency could make quick policy changes that would have meaningful impact on the ground for disaster survivors. And many of the policy changes that they implemented from that are already having real-world benefits. And I wanted to name a few of those. And so here's a few of those changes that I was excited to share with you. So one is that FEMA changed their policy to allow federal assistance for mold remediation after flooding events. And so this might not seem like that big of a deal, but one big challenge after a major flood event is mold remediation in houses. And so that is a place where a lot of disaster survivors really could use more assistance to help them pay for that. And so this one policy change that just allowed funding to be used for that purpose has already granted more than 16 million in mold remediation assistance in Louisiana from last year's hurricane season. And the agency also did another move where they expanded the ways that disaster survivors can prove where they live in order to qualify for federal aid. And so these changes include, now there's an expanded list of documents that could be accepted where you could prove home ownership or occupancy, or you can use in-person engagement. They use in-person engagement with inspectors to help survivors meet these qualifications. And so this is, again, it seems like, you know, a red tape change that wouldn't mean much, but it actually has already allowed a lot more people to receive federal services in their time of greatest need and preventing many from falling through the cracks. And this is because, this is an issue that has very inequitable impacts, because you can imagine that many people in the wake of a disaster might be less likely to be able to prove that they live in a house. So if, for example, if they're not the original owner of the house, if it's a mobile home, there's lots of ways that people tend to be less likely to be able to prove very easily with paperwork after a disaster that they are in fact living in that house. And so this policy change has already allowed for a 5% increase in the rate of survivors that are able to qualify for FEMA aid. And so this has already resulted in delivery of assistance to people across the country. All these policy changes were in place for the last year. So over the last hurricane season, the Tennessee floods, the California wildfires, some of the other natural disasters that you might have heard about, these policy changes were already in place. And so people were able to get more assistance than they might have been able to otherwise. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the administration's work to advance environmental justice. And to put in context a lot of the administration's environmental justice work, I wanted to give a brief history of this issue. So the environmental justice movement has a long history. For decades, communities have recognized that environmental hazards, so where there is where waste sites are sited, where air pollution is worse, where water contamination is greatest, has been unequal in its distribution. And so communities of color, low-income communities have been disproportionately affected by a lot of this kind of historic pollution. And this came out of the broader civil rights movement, where people began to recognize that environmental hazards also had this component, and there was racism in where those facilities were sited. And so by the 1980s, there started to be more technical analysis showing that this was true, and this was systematically true across the country, that Black and Brown communities were disproportionately affected by environmental pollution. And so this launched a bigger movement to try to address environmental justice issues. Many groups organized and have been successful in blocking projects and other issues that of environmental pollution being disproportionately felt. And so even as this movement gains steam, and many are deeply knowledgeable and working on this issue, we still see this racial disparity persist in where environmental pollution is and isn't. And so even when we, first I wanted to call out, if this is new to you and you haven't been thought about the environmental justice movement at all, and you want to learn a little more, I'd recommend this timeline that's on the Environmental Protection Agency website. It's a pretty quick read, and it gives links to external sources, and so you can get a good sense of the history of the movement and the kinds of issues that have happened. And so I wanted to call that out. It's at the link at the bottom. And so these injustices have persisted until today. And so if you're a data person, as I imagine some of you might be, one thing I would just drive home is that you can see this in the data. You can see the inequity that exists across race and income and other factors when we look at data, and you can see it across issue areas across the country. And so this is something that's really able to be seen in the technical analyses. This is a report that came out last year from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on climate change and social vulnerability in the United States. And you can see that they looked at, they separated out 6 different risks from climate change, and they separated out by where they would be felt, by whether it was a low-income community or communities of color. And you can see that you consistently see worse impacts across different kinds of climate-related risks when you separate out by these demographics. And so it is on this history and this long-standing challenge of this issue that the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to prioritize environmental justice. We're going to listen to community leaders that have been doing this work for many, many years. And we're going to link doing this issue to actual policy decisions and allocation of resources. And so I just wanted to give you that history and context so you could see how notable this was, because this is an issue that has not been elevated to the White House to this extent before. And so this is a link to a letter that was written by 2 of the White House leaders focused on this issue, Dr. Cecilia Martinez and Gina McCarthy, who's the National Climate Advisor. And this is thinking about this issue and how do we address these longstanding inequities that the same communities have felt for decades. And so that is the context in which the Biden administration came in and started to think about, what can we do with this issue? How can we address some of that historic harm and also use our existing resources and what we know is coming in terms of climate risk and vulnerability, and how can we really make sure that those benefits are felt by the communities that need it the most. And so that is where the Justice 40 initiative comes in. And this is the administration's effort to put to work a lot of these issues around environmental justice. And so this is an effort to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits of federal investments in climate and clean energy go to disadvantaged communities. And so this is a big deal because it puts a number to it. So it provides that level of accountability, and it also means allocation of resources. So actual benefits, funding, thinking about how communities can be improved. And so as part of that process, there's development of a screening tool that I'm going to talk more about in a second. There's also, as part of that, an environmental justice advisory committee. And this is a never before done White House level advisory committee that includes environmental justice leaders from community groups, nonprofits, and academia. And many of the people on that committee are those people that have been working on this issue for decades and have real expertise in thinking about environmental justice and policy and science. And so they're now directly advising the White House on this topic. And there's also agencies are now, so the federal agencies that are involved in this program are now working on public engagement and thinking about delivering those benefits as we have allocated funding from the recent infrastructure law and other sources of funding. And upcoming soon, there'll be an annual scorecard to provide tracking and accountability for this initiative, which is also a notable step because that really ensures that we're following through on the promises that were made. And so I want to call out specifically this climate and economic justice screening tool that is part of the Justice 40 initiative. And so this tool has just been released in beta mode. So you can go to that link and explore the tool, and it will, you can see all the different metrics that go into it. These bullets are all of the things that it is looking at. So it is what the tool does is that it's looking at all of those factors and then determining whether a community will be considered considered disadvantaged for the purposes of allocating resources under Justice 40. And so the point here was to really look across a lot of different metrics to ensure that we were capturing all the different ways that some communities might be more challenged in a lot of environmental metrics. And so this is really an opportunity for the federal government to look across issue area, because there's not often programs are focused on one of these things, right? Federal programs are focused on clean water or transportation, but this is really trying to look across them, using that to decide where resources should go to which communities. And so this is a pretty neat tool. You can check it out and see what it looks like. And now is the time that they're really taking input. So if you go to the map and you said, oh, that doesn't look right, or I noticed something else given my local knowledge of this area, now is the time where they really want that feedback, because they're trying to really do it in an open source way and get public feedback about the tool. And so another part of thinking about environmental justice is thinking about the science and technology side of it. And so the Justice 40 initiative I just went through is all about thinking about allocation of resources to the communities that need it the most. But on the other side of the spectrum, and where what I'm thinking about as someone in the science office in the White House is, what does it look like to bolster the scientific support for that environmental justice work? And so we have a big opportunity to think about how can we ensure that the science and technology that's being advanced now can inform decisions that affect communities that contribute to addressing environmental justice. And so one example, a couple examples I'm sharing here. One is new satellites that go up all the time. So all the time we have new technology that measures air quality in better ways. And so there's new satellites going up, and that will allow us to better look at air pollution across the country, and it will be more resolved over space and time. And so that gives us a new ability to look at inequities better, right? To really see, who's getting more air pollution compared to other places. And so there's important work to do to make sure that that kind of new information that we get on the science side, that it's feeding into policy decisions. So if we're able to better see inequities, how can we ensure that that information is going into the kinds of decisions that affect communities? So where to put facilities, what kinds of protections should be put in place to protect communities from any air pollution, and how do we really tackle those inequities that we know exist? And so that's the kind of issue that my office is thinking about and working on. And so another big piece of this that my office is really involved in is thinking about cancer, the risk of cancer. And so a big administration priority is the cancer moonshot. So putting a lot of resources toward looking at addressing cancer, and to really change to really address cancer in ways that haven't been done before. And so, one piece of that is there are environmental pollution that comes from cancer-causing pollutants. And so we can do a lot of work to focus on that subset of pollutants and look at how can we address some of the environmental factors that contribute to cancer risk in a lot of communities. All right. And so lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge and federal decision making. And so this is somewhat of a shift from what we were talking about, but I really wanted to include it in this presentation to give you a sense of the breadth of the kinds of things that we can do from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and also because this is a really unique program, and I think has a lot of potential for what it could do in thinking about making sure that we're effectively understanding and addressing the climate crisis using every tool that we have. So So Indigenous knowledge, whether I'm not sure how familiar everyone will be with this, but Indigenous knowledge is another way of knowing. So it's another form of evidence that's different from academic science, and it comes from Indigenous communities, Native peoples, and thinking about how they look at the environment, how they interact with the environment over generations. And so this is knowledge that's passed down from generation to generation. It has evolved over centuries, and it continues to evolve. And Indigenous peoples since time immemorial have been honing this knowledge and advancing it and thinking about their interaction with the world. And so it has both ecological components as well as spiritual components and physical components. And so it's this real whole other system of knowledge and knowing. And, it's largely been underappreciated by a lot of decision makers in our country. And so this is an effort to elevate Indigenous knowledge in thinking about federal decision making. And so the administration has committed to strengthening relationships with tribal nations. This is from the first week in office. The president said, "It is the priority of my administration to make respect for tribal sovereignty and self-governance, commitment to fulfilling federal trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations, and regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal nations, cornerstones of federal Indian policy." And so this priority has led to a lot of initiatives under this administration and thinking about strengthening relationships with tribal nations. But one element of that is this effort to elevate Indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making that's being led by my office, as well as the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House. And so this effort was motivated by requests from tribal leaders for federal guidance around Indigenous knowledge. So ensuring that the federal government and federal employees in all of the work that we're doing are more knowledgeable about Indigenous knowledge and how to include it and think about it in terms of federal decision making. And so we have committed to producing guidance for federal agencies from the White House that will be released later this year. And this was announced by President Biden at the White House Tribal Nations Summit last November in thinking about this initiative. And so what happened last November, there was a memo that went out from my office and the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House that committed the White House to this process. It recognized Indigenous knowledge as a valid form of knowing that should be elevated in a federal context. And it announced this process that's going to be followed to develop this federal guidance. And that process is including several tribal consultations, as well as other public and expert input opportunities. And the memo is at that link below. And so also included in this effort is an interagency working group, which it's sort of the most important thing in the federal government that you might not have heard of is interagency working groups. And these are big groups of people that bring together all the different parts of the government. And so this is where a lot of work happens in the federal government, because you can bring together a lot of people from a lot of different parts of the government. And so this is a sampling of all the different parts of the government that are involved in this effort around Indigenous knowledge. And so you don't have to read all of this, but I wanted to just show you just how sort of widespread this issue, and this is there's a lot of different working groups in the government that focus on climate change and other kinds of topics that are cross-cutting. But I wanted to show you that just to show you the sort of breadth of the kind of work that is necessary if you really want to move things and affect change and get a lot of parts of the government involved in an effort. And so the guidance that we're going to develop on Indigenous knowledge is going to include a lot of different efforts as they come up in federal government contexts. It's going to, of course, define Indigenous knowledge and look at some examples and some background information, because it's really important to look at the historical context on this issue and the role that the federal government has played. And we're also going to look at collaboration and relationship building with tribal nations and Native communities. We're going to look at data sovereignty and confidentiality and the right of Indigenous peoples to decline participation information and decline to share their knowledge if they choose? And how do we think about this with respect to academic science? And how does this come up in sort of scientific contexts like research and integration with different forms of knowledge? And then how does this intersect with different federal laws and regulations and processes that federal employees are often thinking about? And so these are, so the guidance is going to tackle a lot of these things. Some of the kinds of work that we anticipate the guidance would have is how to collaborate with tribal nations around Indigenous knowledge, or Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, is what ITEC stands for, and how to address some of those government-wide challenges that come up in navigating federal processes specifically, and how to respect knowledge holders' rights when we're doing this work. And so we've started some of that external engagement in talking with tribal leaders, tribal organizations, scholars and knowledge holders, and a lot of people that have different kinds of expertise around this issue. And we're taking public comment as well. And that link has a little bit more about this effort and where we're going with it. And so I would just end on this section to talk about the relevance of this to climate change, because a lot of the work that we do around climate change, we as the scientific community and we as the federal government, is thinking about really understanding what the impacts are. And a lot of the climate impacts we know will be very place-based, right? There might be a lot of local knowledge, a lot of places that face climate impacts that we might not have anticipated. And so that is one place where there can be huge contributions from Indigenous knowledge, because it is often Indigenous people, Native communities that are seeing and feeling a lot of those impacts first. And so we can work together and collectively leave a better world for all of us if we look at all forms of evidence and include all forms of evidence in the work that we do to understand climate change and think about how to address it in different ways. And so with that, I just wanted to end and say that I hope this gives you sort of a sampling of a lot of the different kinds of federal policy work that you can do on climate change. And I hope what you take from this and what you take from the seminar in general is all the different ways that you can work to help address the climate crisis and also address a lot of the inequities that exist in our society. I think there are huge opportunities, and no matter where you end up and what you end up doing, there'll be a lot of ways you can have impact in that space. And I think it's really important that we all work together and we use every tool that we have. And there's a lot of places where we can be impactful, even if it doesn't, even if it might not be the primary focus of your work. And so I wanted to leave time for discussion, and hopefully I think so. And so, yeah, happy to have a discussion about the substance or the process. And thank you for your time.
Questions? Up there?
Hi, so I was wondering if the Biden administration is looking into any nuclear energy sources, and if not, is there any reason why they have not explored that option?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not in that space, so I don't want to misspeak on what they are or aren't doing in that space, but that's a really good question.
Okay, we have a question here. So you mentioned ways to combat climate delayism and helping communities via Justice 40. Can you elaborate on how transition to clean energy could support low-income communities, such as those in rural Appalachia currently reliant on fossil fuel exports?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something the administration is thinking about a lot. There's actually a task force that is specifically focused on looking at communities in Appalachia and specifically jobs in the coal industry and how to think about support for those communities as we transition away from fossil fuels. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to think about both on the sort of economic side, right? How do we support the communities that have, you know, helped us keep the lights on for so many years and done a lot of important work in mobilizing our country and industrializing our country. How do we support those communities? And then I think it's also a lot about thinking about how do we prioritize the clean energy transition? Where can we put some of those facilities? How do we make sure that those benefits are equally shared across the country? And so there's lots of different elements that the administration's focused on with that. And then on the so on the industrial decarbonization side, which is the part that my office is a little more involved in, I think one thing to think about is just making sure that we're allocating resources in ways that are more equitable. So we're putting places there. We're making sure that the people that need it most are getting some of the new transition elements. And I think that's a lot of, you know, there's different kinds of programs you can do to support communities in more localized ways. So I think there's a lot of potential there to do a lot more. And the infrastructure bill has given a lot of funding to do a lot of this work. And so that's a big part of what the administration's focused on now, is allocating a lot of that funding that has come in and making sure it goes to the places that need it. And so, you know, that's one reason it was really helpful that that funding came in after a lot of the administration's priorities were set around equity. And so that meant there was already a lot of that infrastructure and a lot of people that were already focused on that equity element of this process. And so then when that funding comes in, you can make sure that it's getting to the places that need it.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I know that the Indigenous Knowledge initiatives are a bit newer, but I was interested in what the collaboration aspect would look like. So do you think you could expand a bit more on how federal agencies will be able to amplify Indigenous knowledge without exploiting it, and like how consultation, how we can sort of go beyond consultation and involve like more agency for Indigenous experts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a lot of potential there, and as it sounds like maybe you know, historically that it hasn't always been the case, and there's been a lot of situations where Indigenous knowledge was exploited by people from outside the community, and so there's that's why it is so important to do this right and get guidance that tells federal employees how to do this better. And so there's a lot of different ways that this is happening now or could happen in the future. So one is around co-management or shared governance of resources. And so there's a few places in the government where this happens, in the federal government where this happens now, where there's co-management of a resource with Native communities. So some of this is happening in the Arctic, in thinking about preserving Arctic resources. Another one that's a little closer to you all comparatively is in Acadia National Park in Maine. There's a shared governance work between the National Park Service and the Wabanaki tribes up there, and they do shared governance of sweetgrass resources in the park. And so sweetgrass is a plant that is of great importance to the Wabanaki tribes up there, and they both for medicinal purposes, for spiritual purposes, and so they work with the Park Service and are leading a lot of the Park Service's research and management of the resources up there. And so that's one great way to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is informing processes and what happens in parks. And the other, I'll give you one more example on that front. That's another cool one that's of note is Papahanaumokuakea in Hawaii, which is in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. It is a national monument, a marine national monument. And and it includes a lot of the Hawaiian traditional culture is directly informing the management of the resources. So they're one of the chairs that manage the marine sanctuary, and so that allows the Indigenous Hawaiian perspective to inform the management of the resource. And so those are some neat ones where you can really build it into the structure of the management of it, and that's been really helpful for ensuring that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people can play a central role in federal decision making. And then to give you sort of other kinds of examples, another sort of arena that this comes out and that we could think about doing more is around policy decisions that the federal government makes on specific issues. And so like the Endangered Species Act is one where it has come up in various ways. So part of the Endangered Species Act is that you have to rely on science, and it is actually a really uniquely strong environmental law that says you have to make the decision based on science. And so that means it really matters what kind of evidence you can find and how you can either to demonstrate that a species is threatened or in deciding how to manage the habitat of that species. There's sort of different stages around the law, but that's one where Indigenous knowledge can and sometimes has played an important role in informing our understanding of how a species is threatened. And so another example that I know about that's a good one for this purpose is the Eulachon is this fish in the Pacific Northwest, and it was it was and is threatened, but an important piece of them figuring out, the extent of its habitat compared to where it used to be, is that there was a project that happened with the Cowlitz Indian tribe there, where they interviewed elders in the Indian tribe. So they had they reconstructed the tribal oral histories to figure out where the fish used to be, where it would spawn, when it would go up the river to the different tributaries, and they were able to reconstruct the whole range of the fish and the run times and all the things that really matter when you're looking at the health of a fish population. And so they were able to do that only because the Cowlitz Indian tribe led that effort, and they were able to incorporate that into the into the endangered species actions that were taken by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So those are a few examples, but I think there's a lot more. So feel free, if you have other ideas, please send them our way, because we have the open public comment period.
Here's a question from the webinar. So how is OSTPE and the work that you do situated relative to the policymaking progress? Are you coming up with the proposals? Are you getting tasked to provide more scientific information to pre-existing proposals? What does this work look like on a day-to-day basis? Are you reaching out to scientists nationally?
Yeah, this is such a good question, because it comes up and there's so many parts of the process that you can be involved in. So, it's kind of all of the above, right? So things come up because you're in a policy environment, it tends to be very fast paced, and things will suddenly come up that you didn't know you had to do. And so a lot of it is so it's both. So some things you can be at the really early stages of, and you can say, in 5 years, I want there to be a law about this, or I want the president to make an executive order on this issue. And so you could be at the early stages there, and you're just sort of figuring it out. You're talking to people, you're trying to figure out all the policy dimensions and the technical dimensions of it. And then there's things at the other end of the spectrum where it's sort of programs that we already have. There's either already a legal mandate. So there's some things that we have to do because Congress has told us that we have to do it. And so it's a good, in the checks and balances of the federal government, some of the direction comes from Congress. And so an example on that you might have heard about is the National Climate Assessment. And so periodically there is an effort to assess climate change in the United States, and we're in the middle of a current process on that to develop the next national climate assessment, and that's a directive that we get from Congress to do that, and so OSDP has to follow through on that, and there's a couple other legal mandates that we have to do things on. And other examples, PFAS chemicals, and thinking about how to advance the science around that. And so a lot of the other kinds of things that happen day to day are a lot more like rapid response kind of things, you know, so we might just get word that next week the president's speaking and he wants to speak about this topic that's a science topic, and so you need to help develop the content and write what he's going to say, or we need to you know, quickly develop a fact sheet or do an event on this topic. So there's a lot of sort of short-term advancing of the issues, which is a lot of you know, preparing for engaging with the public that way. And then, as you might have gathered from my presentation, a lot of it's also just talking with other parts of the government. So, you know, for my work, I might have to go talk to the EPA, and then I might have to move over and talk to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And so there's lots of different parts of the government doing different things. And so that's a really big part of the job. And importantly, because so I'm a political appointee, so it is I am serving under President Biden, but you want a lot of your work to last longer than an administration, right? You want a lot of that work to carry on. And so if I want it to carry on and I'm not going to be there to do it, we need to make sure that it's really integrated into other parts of the government. And so that's one reason to really focus on working with agencies, because that's how you can really advance a lot of the work, because a lot of the people that work at federal agencies will be there a lot longer. And they're the people that are in many cases the most knowledgeable, the most sort of in a position to really carry a lot of the work, because they're the subject matter experts, they're at agencies, they know how to navigate the government, and they can really do a lot. And so, you know, it's kind of all across the board in terms of how a typical day looks like. But in general, I'd say it's pretty fast paced. You're sort of interrupted a lot, and, you know, it's different than an academic environment for sure.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah, please.
So, in my experience, a lot of kind of climate denialist and delayist arguments kind of hinge on the public not either understanding basic environmental atmospheric science concepts, or just not understanding how the scientific process works in general. I'm wondering what the Biden administration or the educational appointees of it are doing to kind of improve STEM education and or address inequities in STEM education.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's definitely, so separate from the climate piece, there's a big effort around STEM education in the Biden administration. And so there's a lot of work around that, particularly around addressing inequities in who has access to a STEM education. And so as part of the racial equity prioritization, there's a lot of efforts on that, in thinking about how do we make sure that everyone has access to a STEM career and that people are able to stay and have a positive experience, as opposed to people being pushed out or choosing to leave. And so wanting to make sure everyone has that option of being able to be a STEM professional if they want to. And so there's a lot of efforts around that. There's a big effort at OSDP on that called The Time Is Now. And they're talking a lot about who should get to be in the sciences and making sure that that's accessible to a broader swath of people. And we did a series of events on that, looking at different kinds of challenges. So they did sessions on LGBTQA, on accessibility in science, making sure disabilities aren't inhibitive of your STEM education, different elements of gender and race, and thinking about STEM fields. So that's a really big focus generally. On the climate side, I think there is potential to think about that, and how do you ensure that there isn't that the misinformation campaigns are not more successful because of the lack of education around the specific scientific topics. I think a lot of that is a lot of what we're focused on is thinking about some of the policy dimensions of that and how do you get around some of those challenges, because the government, I mean, we have a big platform in thinking about how to get spread awareness on issues, but we're also in the position of advancing the policy steps, and so in some ways that can be the focus to make sure that we're really advancing some of the decisions. And so despite that opposition, what are we in a position to do, and how do we really advance a lot of that work? And so I think that's another huge important reason that to involve social scientists, because as I think you were alluding to, there's this history where we see, science is almost weaponized against the public. So if people think they can capitalize on a public that doesn't understand the science, then they can try to use that to spread disinformation. And so how can we use social science to think about getting around that, to get ahead of the people that might choose to do that? And so that's another reason to really focus on interdisciplinary efforts and advance a lot of that work, because we have a lot of work to do on climate.
Thank you. Here's a question from the webinar. So what aspects of your Cornell experience have proven most useful in your present role?
Yeah, that's such a good one. Well, first I'll clarify, I'm going to speak in my personal capacity now on this question, since it's not going to be an administration position. But I think one thing that I really got out of Cornell was just how many places you can go and people that are doing really interesting things are on different topics. And so just that sort of interdisciplinary nature of Cornell, I think having access to a lot of different topics and people working together and seeing how things connect was really big. I did a lot with Cornell outdoor education, and I felt like that complement to the classroom and thinking about and being out in nature, and also thinking about some of these environmental issues and people and who has access to nature, and a lot of elements of that I felt like I really learned a lot by integrating a lot of that kind of thinking. And so to the extent that you can do different kinds of activities, you're kind of in a unique environment where you have access to a lot of different people doing lots of different kinds of things. And I think that can be really useful. And then one more point I'll just make on that is another thing that I did that I found really helpful at the time is the Cornell externship program, which is it's like little mini internships you can do for like a day or a week. And I did one where I just shadowed someone who was at a federal agency in DC, and I followed him around for a week, and he was doing air pollution and climate work in DC. And that sort of opened my eyes that there was this whole world of people doing science policy in DC that I didn't necessarily hear about otherwise. And so I think definitely just exposing yourself to different kinds of people, using that alumni network, doing a lot of that proved hugely valuable for me.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so just back to that question. So I think you said that some people may not understand the issue of climate. So also there are some people who did not perceive that as an issue, or only focus on their personal advantages. So will the connection to the indigenous people help alleviate that problem that you mentioned on the last part of the talk, the connection to the indigenous people, for those who are unwilling to contribute to combat climate change? So do you think the connection to the indigenous will help?
Oh, yeah, can you summarize? Or is it, do I think the indigenous knowledge would help address the climate?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what's it, yeah, how will help
Oh.
change issue, I think.
Yeah, I think that it will. So the indigenous knowledge effort is bigger than that. So I didn't want to make it seem like that was the sole purpose or the end goal of it necessarily, because I think it's a lot bigger than that. I think expanding the systems of knowledge by which the government makes decisions is sort of this high level goal of that work. But I think one big area where it comes up and where it's just so clear why it's needed right now is climate change. And this comes up in a lot of different contexts, but I think, one is around climate impacts. So what are we seeing? And so when we look at how species are affected by climate change, how different plants and animals and the landscape is all affected by climate, it really matters. And it's often Indigenous people that are on the front line of that in knowing what is changing and what isn't. And so the Arctic is a place where this happens a lot. And so people in the Arctic are often the first to notice, if this is not where seals used to be, or there used to be more seals here, or they didn't used to be in this location, or they're behaving differently, or they're having more challenges. And so I think a lot around marine mammals that comes up, and fish, and other places where, they're much more attuned to those sensitivities in the climate and impacts on land and on species. And so that's one way that we can collectively know a lot more about what climate impacts are, and then be able to address them. I think it also comes up a lot on the mitigation side and other ways of thinking about how do we address climate change. And so one piece is that there's now a lot more talk about nature-based solutions, and how do we think about using what we know about nature to address a lot of the climate changes to the climate that we know are here or are coming. And so there's some places where this has come up around because Indigenous people have been here for many, many years and know, how to survive in different climates. And so one example of that is in the Southwest. There's evidence that it's now becoming drier than it was, and even drier than it has been in our lifetimes. And Indigenous people have crops and seeds and specific ways of farming that work in those really arid climates, and some of that knowledge would otherwise be lost because it's not something that Europeans that came over experienced, or it hasn't happened since they've been there. And so there's a lot of potential to revive a lot of that knowledge and practices about how to survive in different kinds of climates. And so I think there's also some potential on the climate mitigation side of thinking about Indigenous knowledge, and how can we better incorporate it. And so, and I think too, with that, I would just say, like, with climate change, I think there's going to be a lot that we don't know, right? It keeps going, and we're doing everything we can to understand every aspect of it. But, we're still all experiencing this in real time. And it's as we go into the future, we're going to learn more and discover new challenges, and things might not be exactly as we predicted. And so we really need to make sure we're incorporating all kinds of knowledge and information that we have to make sure we're making it the best possible planet for everybody.
Yeah, please.
So how does your office and more broadly the administration contend with injustices felt by island territories like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which may experience greater social and political disabilities to climate impacts while not having the same representation and rights as a state?
Yeah, it is a challenge. I'd say, first of all, that the administration's been focused on a lot of making sure the territories have resources, and so there's people in the White House whose whole job it is to focus on Puerto Rico and islands, and making sure that they're included in a lot of the efforts. So one thing that you're correct that in Congress there is not representation the same way for those places, but in the administration, on the executive branch side, there isn't that kind of restriction in the same way. And so there's a lot of potential to include them in the work. And so in the Indigenous Knowledge effort, for example, we were inclusive of island communities, and even if it isn't a federally recognized tribe, they're able to influence and be a part of that effort. And so I think there's a lot of potential there to make sure we are being inclusive of those communities. And that's true in lots of different kind of work too. I think a lot of the funding that has come up around the infrastructure law and other sources of funding, there's also a lot of potential there to ensure that they're included in these efforts. And so and I'd say on the screening tool that I mentioned, that's another thing to look at, because they're working to get as much data as possible about places outside the contiguous US. And that's because that's one challenge, because there has tended to be less data available historically. And so there's a lot of potential there if to make sure that that's included and they have as much data as possible to inform that effort.
Please, yeah. Yeah.
How are Indigenous people compensated for their knowledge?
Did you hear
How are they compensated?
Okay.
Yeah, so that do you mean in the context of that effort, or other in general?
Yeah, you're that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of Indigenous people that are a part of the effort. I am not Indigenous, but there's a lot of people on my team and also in the working group. So the working group that we have is about half comprised of Indigenous people, and they are all federal employees. So they're doing it as part of their job. On the nation to nation interactions, those are not compensated because it's nation to nation, so it's tribal leaders talking with administration leaders on issues. And then there's also a lot of ways that the federal government does have funding and resources that go to federally recognized tribes. And so there's a lot of programs in different parts of the government, but there's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there's the Indian Health Service, there's an Office of Indian Energy in the Department of Energy. And so there's lots of ways that resources are funded in Indigenous communities. I think on our effort, this is a White House effort. I think that's something that well, it is something we're thinking about in terms of how to include it in the guidance. So, what kinds of things would we recommend agencies do in terms of funding? So different kinds of reactions, different kinds of engagements, may warrant funding if there is a collaboration that uses a lot of time and resources of Indigenous communities. And so that is something we're thinking about and how to incorporate that into the guidance and how we think about, what do we tell agencies around that issue.
Time for another question. Go ahead, please.
Can you give an example on how the Justice 40 initiative, where funds have been allocated? I know you have a list on the following slide. Did you have a specific examples of it?
Yeah, so where is it going on Justice 40? Where's the money going? Yeah. So there is 21 pilot programs that are on the first round of Justice 40. And so they have a pilot programs to work on the initial allocation. And so those were programs they identified as being either already serving disadvantaged communities or could be easily sort of adopted for that purpose. And so if you go to, you could probably find it, but this is on the interim guidance on Justice 40 that came out. They have the list of the programs. And so it is, let's see. So it's flood mitigation efforts. It is clean energy installation. So it's a lot of DOE programs that reduce energy burdens on low-income households. It's a lot of clean transportation efforts. So electrification of emission sources from the transportation sector, it's affordable housing, a lot of dealing with legacy pollution, so things like Superfund sites and brownfield redevelopment, dealing with orphan oil and gas wells. So there's a lot of efforts just to deal with legacy pollution from decades past, the replacing lead pipe service lines. Those are some of the examples, but it's, you know, it's existing programs that we're now funneling more money into to prioritize the communities that need it.
So I think our time's up. So let's thank Gretchen again for